Everyone has heard of King John, the tyrant forced to go to war with his barons, leading to the signing of the Magna Carta. People probably know him from Robin Hood or other Hollywood productions, but I'm not here to delve into the realms of mythology, hearsay or legend. My mission is to unveil the man behind the myth. Who was King John? It's 1210. John, the king of notoriety, has truly fallen from grace, excommunicated by name by Pope Innocent III, while the kingdom remained under strict interdict. All the bishops have left England. The cathedrals have locked their doors. The bishops had all abandoned the kingdom, heading mainly for France. Only one bishop remained, the ever-loyal Peter de Rocha, the Bishop of Winchester, also in charge of the financial chamber. The fallen king tries to stop the news getting out about his excommunication, but it's a futile attempt. It is soon the most discussed topic in the land, all behind his back, of course. But John had reason to fear. England was now open to all kinds of torment, though, as of yet, no one had yet made a move. The only crusade called to his relief was in France against the Cathars. There was no foreign invasion. His magnates were not in the rebellion, nor had the Pope called for any retribution against John. In fact, Innocent III hadn't even made a deal of it at all. John wasn't in hell, but purgatory. But it wasn't all that bad, and in the darkness of the interdict there was a glimmer of hope, a candle flickering in the wind. Pope Innocent III might be a firebrand cleric, but he isn't devoid of compassion and forgiveness. He relaxes the interdict somewhat, allowing churches to celebrate the divine once a week, all except a certain faction of naughty monks who had initially disobeyed the Pope's wishes. Said naughty monks, Cistercians, were deprived of this indulgence and to obey the strictness of the full interdict. Funnily enough, Ralph of Coggeshal is silent on the matter once again. If anything, he seems to have got into a sulk and doesn't say much throughout the whole of this period. And the King of England wasn't the only king in a pickle, as Otho of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, whose son had visited England only recently, was also slapped with full excommunication. Innocent wasn't tolerating any silliness. And, meanwhile in Ireland, William de Braose was still a fugitive. And Justiciar, John de Grey, was hot on his heels. De Grey confirms that Marshal only received him for 20 days, before washing his hands of the fugitive. De Braose was with Walter de Lacy. John certainly hasn't given up on the hunt, sending letters to de Lacy. Stop harbouring the fugitive. He must turn himself in. But de Braose fears for his family's life. People have suffered much worse for much less. Added to this, de Lacy won't hand William over to an excommunicated king. But that seems to be just an excuse, for John had not realised that there was in fact a faction that planned to take up the opportunity of the Pope's wrath, to take the throne from John. Not the French, no crusade, but from Ireland, the de Lacy family. They wanted John down, removed, overthrown. There is strong evidence, in the form of a surviving letter, that proves Walter de Lacy was also in contact with none other than Philip Augustus of France. Does this mean that the French could have overtaken the throne? Could there have been a French plot? The bugger is that John jumps the gun. Frustrated by the Irish magnate's refusal to comply, he begins a campaign, completely unaware, possibly, that there was a plan against him, and there is no evidence to suggest otherwise that he knew of de Lacy's plans. But it would be tantalising to think otherwise. Look how John dealt with his enemies in the past. He's a clever bugger. Funnily enough, John had called another scutage, what a coinkydink, just in time. More taxes, more land sieges, and the confiscated church goods. He had more money than ever. And the Jews were next to fill his wrath. Currently, moneylenders were a useful tool, the Jews being considered property of the king, though he could tax them at will. Still, any amount of tax was worth royal protection from the Jewish point of view. Though John, as usual, was taxing the Jews to oblivion. And it was worse now. If a Christian owed money to a Jew and the Jew died, the debt now belonged to John. Not good. But in 1210, John had really pushed this too far, and he has all Jews arrested, and all Jews, male and female. He doesn't care. Their financial records seized, this wasn't looking good. And he is dishing out terrible punishments. And it will get worse as the year goes on. Appalling! One Jew had a tooth knocked out for every day until he could pay. One was hanged for only agreeing to pay 10 grand. This wasn't even anti-Semitism, just pure greed. As he goes for the Cistercians as well, even banning travel for them. The smallest of crimes found the recipients charged without trial, hundreds of marks. There was no mercy here. The king had finally snapped, and no one could rein him in. Anyway, in April, the contents of his Northampton treasury, remember he's moved it from London to Northampton, the contents of the treasury are sent to Bristol. John and his retinue were there by May. The king must have fell about laughing. Unlike all those other attempts to sail for France, this time a great host awaited him. Maybe the punishments at the Cinque Ports sent a message, and now, once more, he had an army. 1,000 sergeants and crossbows, 800 mailed knights, and these were just the ones that called up for fear of scutage. No, many, many more turned up. His army was swelling. He had masons, miners, carpenters, anyone handy in a liga, a siege. John also had 700 ships, at a conservative estimate, a large armada, plus a contingent of Flemish mercenaries. In Ireland, the Marshal needed to prove his loyalty, not wishing to feel the wrath of the king's invasion, so he heads across the sea back to Pembrokeshire, in Wales. Here he makes it clear he has nothing to do with William de Braose. Ever loyal to the throne, heeding the call of the monarch, the Marshal took his place at John's side, as this large force prepared to invade the Emerald Isle. No, not that one. Yes, that one. Unsurprisingly, de Braose decides to sue for peace with John. Okay, no problem. John allows the fallen magnate to sail over the Irish Sea to Wales. Easy. But de Braose is a friend and ally of Llewellyn the Great, and before any talks take place, and no sooner had de Braose landed his ship, there is a brief uprising in Wales, brief and swiftly put down. De Braose knows the game is up, and tries John's patience a second time, now offering 40,000 marks for whatever shenanigans he plans next. Though, this is all from John. I just thought I'll add that. This is John's story. Make of it what you wish. It could be propaganda. Either way, the deal falls through. William de Braose can't risk crossing the sea again to hide in Ireland. Far too risky. Instead, he goes to ground in Wales, a difficult rabbit to catch. John loved a good hunt, but his hunting ground is Ireland. He knows how to lure out William de Braose. And the Great Army sails from Haverford in Wales on the 19th of June 1210, landing in Waterford the next morning on the 20th. All the while, the wealthy Marshal was obliged to entertain John's army at a massive cost as they headed north for Dublin. John first meets with John de Grey in Waterford, Bishop of Norwich, and Judicia, who no doubt updated the king on the current situation. The de Lasses were harbouring de Brosse's family. The army had no time to settle in, advancing through the Marshal's Leinster lands without trouble from the locals, stopping in Kilkenny. And from Kilkenny, the next stop was Dublin. The king is on the hunt for de Brosse's family, his wife Maud, and the two sons, William and Reginald. He knows they are being harboured by the de Lasses. If he captures these, he'll have leverage over de Brosse. By the 28th of June, Walter de Lassey knows the game is up. These are impossible odds. He sends messengers blaming his brother, Hugh de Lassey. He blamed his brother for the whole plot to replace the king. The response? Walter was banished, his lands confiscated. With Walter banished, Hugh de Lassey retreats to his castle in Carrickfergus. Determined to catch him and the fugitives, John heads straight for Hugh, taking castle after castle, themselves giving up without a fight, not wishing to face the wrath of the king. Carrickfergus was the one that stood firm, defying King John. A powerful de Lassey stronghold. John took it in a week. Though neither Hugh, Matilda, nor the sons were there, all had fled. The de Lasses were on the run also, Hugh managing to slip the net with Reginald de Brosse, the youngest son. Together they slipped into Galloway, Scotland. From there, France, where they united with Hugh de Lassey's brother, Walter. Maud and William were not so lucky. Their flight took them to the Isle of Man. With them were their daughter Honoria and young William's wife and children. Unfortunately, they were arrested by Duncan of Carrick, a Scottish lord. Then, under guard of two ships of crossbowmen, the doomed family were taken back to Carrickfergus. John has completed his objectives. Capture the fugitives, no doubt to lure de Brosse out of hiding, and take down the unruly de Lasses. 2 birds, 1 stone, job done. He retreated his forces back to Dublin, taking more castles on the way, arriving there by the 18th of August. Here, John gives the Marshal one more test of loyalty. After all, he harboured the fugitives for 20 days. Marshal, again, just like years before, demanded trial by combat. And just like before, no one was willing to fight him. Despite the Marshal being in his early 60s, an elderly man for the era, he argues that he was ignorant of the dispute, saying de Brosse arrived in 1208 when politics were different, and all Marshal had to do was forfeit Dunmant's castle. Easy. And from now on, the Marshal more or less retires, retreating from battles and glory, an elderly politician determined to get his sons released as hostages from the king. As for Matilda de Brosse, initially the 40,000 marks to save her family was back on the table. Yet apparently she gave up the offer, then changed her mind a third time, this time offering 50,000 marks, even offering to be under arrest until it was paid. If John's account is to be believed, she was extremely fickle. But meanwhile, over the sea, Llewellyn the Great, along with William de Brosse, no doubt saw an opportunity. What with John's army currently in Ireland, this was the time to strike. Ranulph de Blondeville, who had up until this point been on good terms with Llewellyn, was caught with his trousers down. At Toot Hill, the Welsh conducted a surprise raid, placing the Earl of Chester under a leaguer, only broken when Roger de Lacy is the constable of Chester. He set out with a ragtag relief force, pushing Llewellyn back. With the king still in Ireland, it was up to Ranulph, aided by William Longspeed, to deal with this new uprising, and Llewellyn would prove no match. Chester easily put down the rebellion, securing his western border as well as capturing lands, along with the other martial lords. This was no series of skirmishes, but a deliberate scorched earth policy, designed to kill as many Welsh as possible. New castles were built to solidify these gains, including rebuilding the ancient hill fort of Digunway and Holywell. As for John, 2 weeks later he turns his gaze back to Wales, leaving John de Grey and William Longspeed in charge of Ireland, crossing the Irish Sea by September, his captives sailing with him. Valiant and beautiful, Matilda wasn't giving up. However, she must have despaired, unsure of the fate of her family, what with the failed rebellion. Upon hearing his family were captives, William de Braose came to his senses. He handed himself over to John at Bristol. He agreed to pay the 50,000 marks his wife negotiated. But 50,000 marks is the equivalent to the annual income of the king. De Braose is a fallen magnate, and this is very much out of his league. Then de Braose does something rather rash. Instead of remaining with his family and obeying the terms, one job, he gives his guards the slip and hops off over to France. What a swine! This causes Maud to double down, refusing to pay a penny. John has reached the limits of his patience, and the lesser family can go free. But Matilda and William the Younger were dragged away in chains, taken to either Windsor Castle or Corfe Castle, depending on source, and then locked away, ignored and fed nothing, not even water. Then, on the 11th day, the guards unlocked the cell. A gruesome sight. The son, William, only about 18 or 20, was dead of starvation, sat upright, back against the wall of the cell. Matilda was dead also, her head on his chest. She had died at last, and had even tried cannibalism to no avail. She had bitten into his cheek in desperation. This is an awful death. When this news hits de Braose, he collapses in grief, falling ill. Later he'll die also, but not before telling exactly how Arthur died, or at least his side of the story. Remember, de Braose dies in France, and here it's the French side of the story is confirmed. John is the killer, and that's the story he was sticking to. The other magnates couldn't believe it. First Arthur, now this. Their patience was at snapping point also. There is outrage, not just de Braose, but the de Lasses. This is an excommunicated king. People were beyond fed up. John tries mitigation, but his credibility is shot to bits, even despite his success in Ireland. Remember that failed meeting with Stephen Langton? Well, that was rescheduled, but had come to nothing as Langton hears of John's huge army and refuses to cross the channel. Third time would be a charm, and at the Courier, John's envoys have achieved peace with the Pope. The interdict could be lifted, along with excommunication, but it came with strings attached. Public fealty to the Pope. And on the 14th of April, 1211, Pope Innocent III deputised 2 members of his household. Pandulf, a subdeacon, clergy, and Doran, a nice hospitaller. These two were sent forth to deal with John. Should the king accept this oath of fealty, all would be forgiven. Unfortunately, John at this time was again busy beating up the Welsh. Other papal deputies would have to wait. Oh, no doubt Llewellyn saw that John was preparing a full-scale invasion into Wales. He wasn't going to get caught off guard. So, in 1211, it was Llewellyn the Great who rose up again in rebellion, taking back lands lost in previous years. If John was plotting against him, he'd be the one to strike first. An enraged John was soon on the march, arriving in Chester. This was a major campaign. Even Gwenwynwyn and Rhys Grieg were off the naughty step, having had a 2-year timeout. They knelt to John with a huge host of Welshmen, Llewellyn's enemies. As we know, Wales is ruled by tribal leaders, the princes. These princes are equal to Llewellyn. They've been feuding for generations, old grudges. This is their time. The English king then looked towards Gwynedd, and his army marched forth. He wanted it utterly destroyed. From Chester, John's host moved slowly in the direction of North Wales, crossing into the Perfeilltwad, a region between the Dee and Conway rivers. But no one opposed him. Llewellyn wasn't mindless, and had retreated everything not nailed down to Snowdonia. Animals, food, weapons, people, everything. A scorched earth policy in reverse, without the drawback of buggering up all of your own land. So when John reaches the ancient hill fort of Dygunway, previously destroyed by Llewellyn, Chester had done his best to rebuild it. This, plus the lack of food, meant disaster. Let's put it this way. An egg, yes, a regular chicken's egg, was sold for £1.50. A soldier's daily wage. John was forced to withdraw back to Chester, though not to quit, to consolidate, to work out better logistics. And by July, he invaded Wales again, marching from Shropshire in the direction of Dygunway. Before long, he was in Snowdonia, ravaging Llewellyn's heartland. Apparently, the Bishop of Bangor refused to treat with an excommunicated king, so John orders the city burned. And soon, said bishop was under siege in his own cathedral. Llewellyn wasn't used to this level of barbaric cruelty. He sends his wife. Oh, and did I mention that Llewellyn's wife is John's daughter, Joan? Yes. So John's daughter, Joan, is sent forth to treat with a tyrannical, psychopathical father. It's his daughter, no doubt a daddy's girl. Of course she's able to sway him. And peace is attained. Apparently she's quite the diplomat. And I'm not making all this up, adding powerful women into the story when they're not meant to be. They are meant to be. This is how events unfolded. They were always there. If anything, it was the Victorians who edited them out. Naughty Victorians. And Joan even negotiated good terms given her father's temper, and Llewellyn remained alive. He kept Snowdonia. The rest, including the Perfeilltwad, he lost to the crown, to pay homage to the king ad infinitum. All this was on the 11th of August, 1211. The day after William de Braose's funeral in Paris. Because according to Wendover, after suffering tribulations as if he was dying of pain, he dies in Paris and is buried at St. Victor on the vigil of St. Lawrence. A defeated, broken and fallen magnate. What more can I say? But peace had finally been restored to Wales. And just like the Irish and the Scots, the Welsh were humbled by the English king. And at Aberystwyth, Fawkes, De Brute, builds a castle to join the others, being built to cement John's power. But there was one last thing to do in Wales: subjugation of the already loyal south. Welsh, who knelt before John, now joined with Fawkes de Brute, the mercenary captain and seneschal of Cardiff. John has no intention of letting the Welsh owe simple fealty. He has been destabilising the native Welsh for a while now, continuing his dismantling of the overlordship enjoyed by Llewellyn the Great. Now his work would be complete. John's achieved the impossible. He's united England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales under one banner, a feat only marred by his excommunication. That and the loss of the continent. The Pope would be easier to deal with. Currently, Innocent III was indifferent rather than hostile. He'd even sent envoys to deal with John at Northampton, with the full powers of absolution. But unfortunately, John was riding his power trip, having subjugated all of his enemies bar one. But Philip, Augustus, wasn't off the hook yet. So naturally, John rejects the Pope's simple demand of fealty. Though the Pope's letters exist, and the words are in a confrontational tone, which will have only escalated John's already foul mood. Two stubborn men, as bad as each other. Besides, it was all kicking off on mainland Europe, especially with France and the Cathars. Even the Count of Toulouse had been excommunicated. There was never a better time for John to strike. So getting religious absolution was at the back of his mind. He still had allies in the south of France. He needed the north, but Philip was losing his grip. Now was the time. He's even made an alliance with the disgraced and also excommunicated Otto of Germany. Now, John needs more funds. Armies aren't cheap. Funds he plans to get. He had more than quadrupled his annual income, easily enough to pay for a military excursion to wrest his lands back. But John's never happy with money. A new armada is slowly assembled, while John conducted affairs locally, possibly putting down another revolt in Wales, placing him in Hereford, as the castle at Aberystwyth was burnt down. And then came winter. Christmas was spent at Windsor, and in early 1212, John sets off once again to meet William the Lion in Newcastle. The Scots may have called this meeting, as there was a pretender to the Scottish throne, Guthrum MacWilliam, but all was well, and on the 4th of March, 1212, John knights the Scottish king's young son Alexander, in a grand ceremony just outside of London. A 13-year-old lad, one of the hostages, who would one day inherit the Scottish throne. But for William the Lion, the king of Scotland, despite all this, he must have seen the Scottish independence faltering. The future of Scotland would be an English vassal, and one day that might have huge repercussions. By Easter, the call to arms was on. In Nottingham, a great army was summoned for late May, and the troops slowly arrived. John's allies in France were preparing, and Philip must have felt a pang of panic. Not only did he have a crusade in the south of France, he was facing an invasion from the English. But at the muster in Nottingham, the order was given to postpone, possibly due to a French counterattack on the ships. John gave the order to reinforce Portsmouth Harbour with the Great Wall. Something was certainly going on, as Henry the Bourne contested his service in Trowbridge, in Wiltshire, and gets his lands confiscated, and the same occurs to Ralph de Bernier, and many more. John's not having the best of time with loyalty with his own barons. The invasion of France was still on. John wants to move his siege engines to France by June. but his knights and barons cause a bigger fuss with this campaign in Scotland. A part of the deal with Scotland is loyalty goes both ways. He's promised to protect the Scots, and this MacWilliam is proving a pain in the backside, so John is obliged to deal with it. So he sets off to Scotland, hoping that the current loyalty with his barons wouldn't fall apart in the process. The king is soon in Cumbria. The Bambercon mercenaries he had taken with him were set into Scotland on a hunt for MacWilliam, along with other contingents, including one led by the newly knighted 13-year-old heir to the Scottish throne, Alexander. Here, MacWilliam was betrayed. His own men handed the pretender over to the young lad, Alexander, who promptly marked him for execution. The rebellion was over. Although, once John had gathered his forces in order to head back down south, the loyal Scots were nowhere to be seen. Once William the Lion was reunited with his son, the mood changed. And soon John learned, while having a feast, that Llewellyn the Great had gathered a large host and crossed the Conway, taking the Perfilfulad without error. The new castles currently under construction were destroyed. The garrison either captured or beheaded as a warning. Only de Gunway and Ruthven held the long defeat. The Norman foothold was faltering. This wasn't the craziness of a rebel prince, but a masterstroke. All the Welsh princes had joined with Llewellyn. John had a war on his hands. A real war. He may have achieved the impossible, what his ancestors couldn't, the unification of Wales against him. Can he keep it? Llewellyn the Great is about to put John to the test.